Hello, role-playing people, and in this episode we're going to have a look at Koldunism for Vampire the Masquerade, one of my favorite, if not my absolute favorite sorcery in the game. What I find great about it is precisely the mystery and uncertainty surrounding this practice. Is it of Kupala? Was it discovered by Tzimisce the Eldest? Does it predate the Tzimisce presence in the Old Country? Does it require deals with demonic patrons and is thus infernal? Or does it simply draw its power from the spirits of nature? Before even attempting to answer all of these questions, I need to mention that I have done my homework as thoroughly as I could, and the books I've used in the making of this episode are Libellus Sanguinis, Book 1, Masters of the State, Transylvania by Night, the Dark Ages Tzimisce clan novel, Blood Magic, Secrets of Thaumaturgy, Blood Sacrifice, the Thaumaturgy Companion, the Tzimisce Clan Book, Revised Edition, The Player's Guide to the High Clans, fantastic book, the 20th Anniversary Dark Ages Core Rule Book, the 20th Dark Ages Book of Secrets, V20 Rites of Blood, V20 The Black Hand, and possibly others that I'm not remembering at the moment, but they might have influenced my perception. What's become obvious to me is that Vampire does a sort of a mashup of quite a few types of folk magic traditions, which of course isn't a bad thing, but it makes it pretty confusing since each country or region will have its own myths and legends regarding its practitioners of magic. So who are the Koldun in real life? The articles I've read so far, which are based on works from the 1990s, folkloristics, ethnographic studies, and even persecution texts, as polymaths like René Girard would call them, all show that Kolduni are sorcerers slash shamans slash healers slash witches found in rural Russia. How long have they been around? That I don't know, but what I can tell you is that the peasants' attitude towards these sorcerers was ambivalent. Though they performed a variety of supposedly magical services for their rural communities, the Koldun were also considered malevolent because they received their powers from unclean forces such as demons or the restless dead, and they can also curse you or inflict misfortune. It is because of this, as is the case with a lot of practitioners of magic throughout history, not just in rural Russia, the Kolduni are outcasts. They are socially and economically marginalized, and unfortunately for them, sometimes they are persecuted in the physical sense, assaulted, beaten, even killed by their communities. In light of this, the write-up we get in the 2001 revised Tzimisce clan book for the Koldunic Way of Sorrows plays right into this. It is a way that is based on cursing your enemies, inflicting all kinds of effects, from uncontrollable weeping to rage to horrible misfortune and even starvation. But in most of the titles I've mentioned earlier, Koldunism is presented as a form of spirit magic, which deals mostly with elemental spirits. Judging strictly by the way it is presented by the game, without bringing in too much of the real-life practices and attested ambivalent attitudes, is it infernal in nature? I'm very much tempted to say, not really, though a lot of the books from the first of the Libellus Sanguinis collection and all the way into the 20th Anniversary Book of Secrets clearly state that this power is either drawn from a devil, lesser demons, or Kupala. Ogam is also considered a variant of the sorcery in 20th Anniversary, and we are told that the Lianan drew their power from a dark, powerful spirit of the land. Delving into the 2001 clan book, we are told from the perspective of more or less informed characters that Koldunism is of Kupala because it was taught to the eldest by this demon. Similar information is presented by quite a number of books that expand upon the setting. The Drakon of Constantinople himself rejected the use of such magics, deeming them unclean, but after looking at the history of this character both within and outside of Constantinople, and the fact that it wanted nothing to do with any kind of sorcery, or that most of its children are on the road of heaven, it makes sense that they would deny themselves anything that might be even remotely close to infernalism out of moral considerations. Kupala is undoubtedly involved in pretty much anything that happens in the Old Country during the Age of the Koldun, thus he can be mistaken as the source of many things, but as we've seen in the books we've explored for the Kupala lore hunt, this entity doesn't actually share any of its own power. To say that it gave the eldest authority over spirits out of its own ability and volition is not only unfitting of a demon like Kupala, but it's contradicted by a few sources. According to V20 Rites of Blood, in the current Nights, among the Sabbat, there is a resurgence of Koldunism. The Sabbat have had infernalism issues for quite a while now, and even under the watchful eye of their Inquisition, Koldunism is at least tolerated, thus deemed not infernal, at least no more infernal than the breaking of the bonds, which used the sacred fire flower, the rites performed on Kupala's night, or the corruption all fiends suffer within the Old Country. This is a perspective we find in most of the books, starting from 1997 onward, even in titles such as the Transylvania Chronicles, which we have also discussed for the Kupala Lore Hunt episodes, and we've actually discovered that there are Koldun who perform rites around the Cathedral of Flesh to keep the taint of Kupala from spreading and infecting more of the land, and those rites work. Well, glad to see the ambivalent opinion regarding this sorcery is preserved in-game, but the whole idea of Koldunism as a cleansing is very much supported by the rites Tzimisce perform on Kupala's night. This is when the voivodes use Koldunism to gain access to the spirit realms and battle the corrupted spawn of Kupala to keep the taint from infecting, I don't know, maybe ancestral places of power. Who knows? Another indicator to the fact that Koldunism isn't necessarily infernal in essence is found in the fact that, surprisingly, a lot of its attested practitioners who resided and learned these ways within the Old Country remain on the road of humanity even to this day. Tzimisce enkonu like Dracula or Danica Ruthven, and it seems that most practitioners belonged to now extinct revenant families. Perhaps there's a clue here, but we'll come back to this idea later. Another argument for the fact that Koldunism isn't a taint and doesn't require a pact with Kupala is that anyone can learn the ways of this magic regardless of where they might be in the world. All of the vampire sources that I've read for the making of this episode, the ones that cover the mechanics of this sorcery, not the lore and rumors surrounding it, point out that it is always learned as an out-of-clan discipline. Thus, it is not passed down through the blood. Therefore, it is not something only the Tzimisce can do because of direct exposure or a pact with Kupala. Flipping through even more books, we can see canonical characters who were born and embraced on other continents, practicing Koldunism just fine as something they learned from their sires or from other sources. Coming back to the Carpathians, you have the Old Clan and the Oradea League who rejected both vicissitude and the practices of the Sabbat, though they are often associated with Koldunic practices precisely to fight off potential taint. Koldun of the Talmahera, the True Black Hand, are fierce enemies of infernalists, and they use Koldunism to hunt such Cainites down and, surprise surprise, to enslave or bind demons. So, who's right? Your guess is as good as mine, though my preferred version of the lore is that Kupala, forced by circumstances, hoping to be released, offered the eldest not direct power over spirits, but the lore of how one might enlist their aid. Knowledge in itself is amoral, though it can be used for either good or bad, so I personally prefer the version in which this sorcery is not infernal in nature. Now, let's set aside history and morality of Koldunism and look at just how this sorcery works within the game. It is a form of magic that enlists the assistance, whether willing or unwilling, of the nature spirits found within a region or a Crina. At risk of stating the obvious, the term Crina is actually misused in the 20th anniversary edition, since it is used to refer to the magical practice itself, the way of magic, but that is not what Crina means. In a majority of Slavic languages, it means fringe, borderland, region, so it refers to a place, a land. The Koldun don't study Crina and they don't perform Crina, but they slowly become acquainted with the spirits of the lands, what makes these entities tick, what they like and dislike, what piques their interest, and how they can be called or manipulated. Unlike other sorceries that make use of power of will and formula, or a blasphemy shrine to a supposedly godly patron, or systematic violation of taboos, Koldunism makes use of environment and lore. Though there are some rules variations here, with some books insisting that Koldunism is a separate knowledge, others treating it as an occult specialty, and others treating it as a regular discipline requiring an attribute plus occult role, depending on the type of spirit being called to aid, the practice itself is based on lore, on the practitioner's familiarity and connection with spirits, and ability to manipulate them. And if you're anything like my players, you're already asking yourself, yeah, how can a sorcery be based on lore? How does knowing silly folk tales about nature spirits allow my character to spend one blood point and make magma shoot from the ground all within one combat round? This is so confusing. How does it work? I'm glad you asked that. First thing to note is that unlike other sorceries which have detailed explanations in regards to how they work, Koldunism isn't really explained narratively, even on a basic level in any of the books. Why, just to illustrate this, in the Dark Ages Tzimisce clan novel, when Ilie el Frumos, or Ilias the Beautiful, uses this sorcery, he makes use of blood sacrifice, symbols and sigils, but mostly something the author presents as a divine language. And I quote, "It was a language no longer spoken by any mortal tongue. His sire had taught him, a language older than that of the Romans and Greeks, handed down through their line, and possibly only the other Koldun lineages. It was properly used for only a few purposes, written or spoken in treaties to the eldest or its bogatir children, invocation, propitiation, thanks or praise to gods and spirits. Tonight, Ilias invoked." As interesting as this passage is, since it almost makes me think Koldunism manipulates spirits by using fragments of Enochian, it is not supported by any of the other books. None of them mention the use of language as an instrument to the casting of this magic. And another thing, who has the time to draw runes and sigils within one round? Well, what Ilias is using is not a way of Koldunism, but a ritual, so that's an important distinction which we will address at a later time. Another important distinction is that Koldunism isn't science, it's not hermetic magic, so it isn't very precise. It's based on lore and, of course, the belief that there are spirits all around, and the lands and elements themselves bear some form of intelligence or life. Belief is an easy thing to gain, especially upon witnessing the potent and awe-inspiring displays of a Koldun's magic. But what about the lore? What that lore does, whether it was learned from a demonic patron or a Cainite mentor, probably an ancient Dacian of the Ruthven bloodline, or a 15th century text found in Dracula's castles, written in Romanian but spelled with Cyrillic script. What any of these things will teach would-be practitioners is the protocol to follow in order to manipulate a spirit into doing something for you in accordance with its ability. The storyteller and players can get really creative with that protocol since it isn't described in detail in any of the books. It can consist of gestures or sigils or sounds, verbal commands in dead languages, maybe instruments that resonate with the spirit being called forth. But the procedure will always differ from element to element. One does not call out to living flame in the same way they call out to the spirits of the wind. Understanding the proper way and the safe way to interact with the spirits and enlist their aid without rousing their wrath can take decades and depends a lot on the region, on the Krina we mentioned earlier. The spirits themselves, though they might be of the same element the Koldun is already familiar with, differ from land to land. The water spirits of the Black Sea are not the same as the water spirits of the Mediterranean Sea, or those of a river like the Volga. Interacting with the entities of a land that the Koldun is unfamiliar with imposes a +2 difficulty until the practitioner comes to know the spirits better. In Revised Edition, the ways of sorcery are divided according to the elements: fire, water, air, earth, and spirit, with some of them being universal, so no +2 difficulty there. In 20th Anniversary Dark Ages, they are divided according to regions, and you have the Black Sea Krina, the Transylvanian Krina, the Białowieża Krina, the Krina of Enoch, the Krina of the Well, and Genius Loci, or Genius Loci, depending on your preferred pronunciation. While some Krinas lean heavily into that infernal potential of Koldunism, which is emphasized quite a bit in 20th Anniversary, the ways as presented in Revised Edition are much more benign and simply tied to the elements. Now, I was going to say the one thing interaction with spirits cannot be done without is blood, sacrifice, the spilling of either blood or vitae, but wouldn't you know it, in 20th Anniversary there are exceptions to that rule as well, because if the Koldun is practicing their magic within their primary region, they are considered already attuned to the spirits which aid them even without the gift of blood. This is not the case in a book such as The Player's Guide to the High Clans, where both rituals and ways of Koldunism require the expenditure of blood, and actually I want to read a few passages. By offering a sacrifice of his own blood and successfully casting this ritual, a Koldun calls the attention of nature spirits and strikes a bargain with them. Although the vampire bargains from a position of power, he does so courteously rather than as a tyrant who must be obeyed. System: if the ritual succeeds, spirits in the area who want the blood may appear before the Koldun and offer service. The Koldun may accept the offer or propose his own deal. This is from the ritual Rouse the Elemental Spirit. Now I want to read from a level 3 ritual, Conjure Spirit. As he once bound the least of spirits as spies and aids, so may a Koldun with this ritual call more powerful spirits. Such creatures answer proper beckoning and oblations of blood, which needn't come wholly from the caster. They do not make pacts. They trade favors. The Koldun must pledge something of value to the spirit, which may seem trivial to human or vampiric notions of worth. If the spirit likes the offer, it awaits the price. Should it find the price reasonable for the service provided by the vampire, it drinks the blood and goes about its new business. It does not bargain or haggle, nor does it deign to listen to threats. If the vampire insults the spirit with a poor offering, it will not remain to continue bargaining. It simply vanishes to wherever it belongs and leaves the vampire with a pool of cooling, untouched blood. Okay, this clearly shows that when it comes to rituals, having a means of more complex communication is very important, since the Koldun literally asks the spirits for help. We can see gifts are also an essence of this practice here. There is no long-term pact, but merely an exchange of services. Now let's read something related to demons from the same book. We're having a look at the Conjure Demon Level 5 ritual. This ritual follows upon the principles of Conjure Spirit, though with greater rewards for success and peril for failure. A proper casting allows an offering of blood to summon a mighty demon of the old country. Such a being never shows fear and perhaps need never show fear, for its powers usually exceed the Koldun's by far. Still, demons called in this fashion remember the Koldun who came before and humbled them with mighty curses and enchantments. Out of memory of those ancient pacts and fear that those pacts might one night find renewal, demons treat Koldun with respect as equals. How about that? This is a very interesting passage because it says that even powerful demons fear the Koldun. While initiate practitioners can only manipulate spirits of nature, masters of Koldunism can bind demons. They humble demons with mighty curses. I cannot help but think of the possibility that Koldun rites might have existed before Kupala, and are probably the very thing which bound this demon into the Carpathians. Certainly, the clan book tells us it was the Shadow Lords which pulled the earth apart with their claws, threw the demon in, and slammed the earth shut. This is actually very similar to the capabilities of the Way of Earth. Could it be that in their ancestral struggle with Kupala, the kinfolk of the Shadow Lords, or even the Lords themselves, were the original Koldun? This is of course speculation, but it makes sense to me because the Lupines learn gifts from spirits, and they can access the Middle Umbra with ease. After Tzimisce the Eldest came along, we know he pushed the Lupines out and turned the kinfolk into servants and revenants, throwing this little hypothesis next to the idea that Koldun reenact a rite of banishment on Kupala's night, according to all the books that mention this. It is not impossible that Koldunism was, initially, a way of keeping the lands clean of demonic taint, preserving the spirits of nature. This, of course, changed once the Tzimisce, influenced by Kupala, figured out a way to corrupt this magical practice, right? So there was a syncretism happening there. Even so, it's probably less tainted than demons would like, since apparently they fear the Koldun. So the real-life ambivalence towards the Kolduni has been beautifully worked into the game, not only within the lore, but also within the mechanics, leaving us with a lot of questions, which, though distressing at times, ultimately allows each storyteller to decide upon the origin of Koldunism themselves and portray this practice in their preferred manner without really doing injustice to the real-life practices, which are also ambivalent and confusing. On this note, my biggest regret so far is the inability to reconcile Koldunism as recorded within folklore and ethnographic studies regarding rural Russia with the old country and the Carpathians as the setting of Vampire presents it. See, in Romania we don't have Koldun and we don't celebrate Kupala either. I actually want to invite any of my dear listeners from neighboring countries to leave a comment and tell me, please tell me, if the Koldun is something found in their folklore. We don't have them here, at least not as attested in Russia, but, this is a big but, Romania does have its own legendary sorcerers. These guys are called Solomonari, also known as Grindinari, Hailbringers, or Izgonitori de Nori, Cloud Banishers. And in some regions, like Țara Moților, They are called zgrimniciesh, which I cannot help but notice sounds a lot like some pronunciations of Zimici. Zgrimniciesh, zimiszcze, zgrimniciesh, zimiszcze. Pretty close. Though the term Solomonar only entered the Romanian lexicon sometimes in the 17th or 18th centuries and seems to be the result of syncretism with Judeo-Christian culture, it is believed that these sorcerers are far older and were actually Dacian shamans or priests of Zalmoxis. Remember Danica Ruthven? Now, the legends say that these sorcerers could control some elemental spirits. They could conjure or banish clouds, they could call down hailstorms, even lightning, using their enchanted axes. They wore white cloaks, were indeed reclusive, predominantly living in isolated, wild areas. They learned their magic from a mentor, and some legends say they even had a school located beyond the shroud. They recorded their wisdom in their books, and most interesting, they were also healers, and they tamed and banished balauri, one of the archaic terms for dragons. Dragons, kind of like the Zimici clan nickname. They had significant control over the dragons of water and air to the extent that they could either bind them or banish them, which is why, saving the best title for last, they are also called the Dragon Riders. These sorcerers took more than 1 decade to hone their craft, even with all available mentorship, and only 1 out of 7 initiates actually became a full-fledged Solomonar, since the trials they underwent were very dangerous and often deadly. Kinda like the Witchers. So to conclude this already very lengthy episode, Koldunism has always been perceived as both benevolent and malevolent. Though some aspects of the lore don't quite make sense with the real-life practices, which are confusing in of themselves, Vampire does a pretty good job at bringing this mysterious, attested magical practice into the setting of the game, both in terms of lore and rules. If you've ever wanted to play a Koldun but realized it doesn't fit in with the tone of the game because it's infernal in nature, well, I'm here to tell you that this is very much up for debate, and each storyteller can decide upon what the origins of this sorcery are in their own chronicle. You're not really in danger of misusing or misrepresenting this practice, whether it comes from Kupala or not, no more than calling it Koldunism, which is attested in rural Russia, and associating it with the Carpathians, which are somewhere else altogether. So it's all good. The spirits differ from land to land, and names as mortals use them are just convention anyway. That being said, Koldunism is really fun to have in vampire games, very flavorful, sometimes incredibly scary, and given the rarity of its practitioners or lore that might allow one to become initiated, you can focus entire Zimici chronicles on the acquisition and deepening of Koldunic knowledge. I, for one, really love the possibilities, both mechanical and narrative, this sorcery brings to the game. Thank you very much for bearing with me. Take care, have fun, and don't forget to play.